More like mentioned, my name is Joseph McFatridge. I am an English teacher at Munford High School. I've been teaching there for, this is my 7th year. I have my wife Ashlyn in the back. So she is thankful that she has other people besides her and the school librarian that listen to my theological rambles. So she's very excited for this evening. Fairy tales are something that I've really been wrestling with for probably about the past 8 or 9 years. But I started reading them very seriously in grad school. I didn't study them in grad school. It's just kind of a side reading that I did. And I've always been a very large fantasy fan, right? And have grown up on the Chronicles of Narnia, Tolkien's The Lord of the Rings, and fairy tales were not something that I was really interested in until grad school. Right, which is kind of a weird inversion, right? You go to grad school, and that's when you read the serious stuff, or the really complex stuff. But as I started to dig into these fairy tales, there's really a lot more there. There's a number of things that I think actually teaches us, in some ways, more about life, I would argue, than high fantasy. That high fantasy definitely has a lot of very real things to teach us, but fairy tales specifically tie into the Beatitudes in a way that I don't think high fantasy typically does. But that's definitely something we can analyze more during the Q&A session. So a good place for us to start is just asking, what is a fairy tale? That typically if you ask someone what a fairy tale is, they'll list one of these basic definitions that I hear a lot, right? It's a moral tale, right? It's a tale just to teach kids how they should act, nothing more, nothing less. It's a fantastical children's story, right? It's a tale where a prince rescues a princess, right? A lot of these answers that you'll get have to do with kind of just the entrapments, just kind of the area surrounding where most fairy tales take place, right? Knights, swords, princes, dragons. But that's not really what makes a fairy tale, which we'll talk about in just a few minutes. Also, we have a story with a happy ending, right? This idea that fairy tales always end happily. And while that's the case for most fairy tales, it's certainly not the case for all of them, which we won't be delving into some of those non-happy endings during this presentation. But once again, during the Q&A, if you want to bring that up, we can definitely discuss that more. Now, I think one of the best understandings of what fantasy literature is, we'll talk about what fantasy literature is, and then we'll get into what specifically a fairy tale is. But I think the best understanding of what fantasy literature is has to do from Tolkien's essay on fairy stories. Now, it's important for us to understand that when he's writing on fairy stories, he's not talking about just the subcategory of fairy tale. He's talking about just kind of fantasy in general. Fairy here being a bit of a broader word than we typically view with our term fairy tale. So first of all, a few things that Tolkien says that a fairy tale is not. First of all, it is not a beast fable. Classic example of this is the tortoise and the hare. That we have a lot of beast fables that are typically viewed as fairy tales, but really all they are stories where people animals are being stand-ins for people. You could tell the exact same story about the cripple and the high school athletes, and it's the same story. That the high school athlete's like, oh, I got this in the bag, decides to sleep for a few hours, and the cripple slowly makes his way across the finish line. It's the exact same story, right? So once again, these beast fables typically just have animals being stand-in for people. A fairy tale is not something that is untrue, that is within the world that it is told. So it's not something that's just in a dream sequence, for instance. Alice in Wonderland probably being the best example of this, right? At the very beginning, Alice falls asleep, then all of this mystical, magical stuff occurs, but then she wakes back up, right? Fairy tales or fantasy has to be about something that is true within that world. And finally, I think it's vital that we understand that fairy tales are not tales merely for children. That there's this phenomenal quote that Tolkien has: children's books, like their clothes, should allow for growth. We currently have a 17-month-old, and we know the importance of making sure that you have clothes that allow for a little bit of growing room. Otherwise, you will be buying clothes constantly. But like their clothes, their books should allow for growth, and their books at any rate should encourage it. So here, we're talking about giving children stories that they can enjoy and they can appreciate on some level, but they can't fully understand it. They can't fully grasp it, right? That we like to, in this day and age, talk about, well, this toy specifically is for 6 to 10 months, right? We're currently trying to figure out, okay, what's the month limit where our daughter is versus where is she developmentally? Is she an average kid? Is she above average, below average? We're trying to figure all that out. But in the end, what matters is that what you are giving them is something they're able to grow in, right? And we see this with their toys. We see this with their books, that ideally we shouldn't just keep them to, well, you are in first grade, so here's the first grade section, right? Because if we're being honest, the Bible itself is not in the 99-year-old section, right? That it is talking about fundamental truths that we will never fully comprehend because God himself is so far beyond us. So if we want our children to understand that to understand God is not even just a lifelong pursuit, but a pursuit of eternity growing in him, then we should really start with their fantasy stories. Now, let's talk about what Tolkien discusses about what a fairy tale actually is. And here I have a number of quotes from him. Yeah, first of all, that fairy or fairy tales itself may perhaps most nearly be translated by magic. So they're really defined by the word magic, whether this be some sort of magician, whether it be a fairy, whether it be a magical item, a magical land, that in order for a story to be a fantasy story, it has to have some type of magic in it. And Tolkien then goes on to clarify kind of the importance of magic, the role of magic within these fantasy worlds. He says that magic produces or pretends to produce an alteration in the primary world. Its desire is power in this world, domination of things and wills. Now, it's important that we understand here that the word domination, the way he's using it here, is more of in a neutral context, right? In some ways, it can be viewed as good in certain instances and evil in other instances. But he doesn't really go into his Lord of the Rings during this essay. This essay was given prior to that, but within the Lord of the Rings, I think we see a very helpful understanding of the elves versus Sauron, or the elves versus Saruman. That elvish magic always makes the elves and people around the elves grow closer to the world, right? The magic in the everyday things, that they use their magic to cultivate, to grow closer to the ground, and it makes them have a better understanding of the world in general. In contrast, the evil in Tolkien's work does the exact opposite. That if you have ever watched The Two Towers and you see Fangorn Forest where the trees are just decimated, there is a lot of gnashing, there is a lot of fires and anvils, very different fire and anvils than the dwarves that make beautiful things, because the creatures of evil create ugly things, hideous things, and that's the point, because it's not to refine the world, to bring stewardship to it, as we see at the start of Genesis, but it's in order to bring it under your control, rather than to be stewards of it. So the purpose of magic, to kind of sum all this up, is to have some sort of control over the world. And it could be control that actually brings you closer to the world or actually separates you from the world. Destroying the world, as we see with completely devastated forest, and also destroying yourself because you are no longer doing what you're supposed to do as a creative being. Now, this ties into Tolkien's other point when he talks about recovery, which includes return and renewal of health. This is a regaining of a clear view. And what magic is supposed to do, like it's mentioned with the elves, is help us to understand the world around us. That if you use power, if you use authority only to further yourself, then you're having a very fogged view of life. That what magic within stories is supposed to do is supposed to teach us that in our actual life, we need to slow down sometimes. That if we only think about even something as simple as a pen, as just an instrument, then you're not actually enjoying something that God has created, something that has been created by minds that God has created, right? That it's through appreciating the small things that we're able to appreciate the larger things, right? So if you appreciate a good pen, you can then appreciate the mind that created it, and then you appreciate the mind that created that mind. And that's what fantasy stories should help us do. Now, let's also talk about the spectrum of fantasy stories. Like I said, Tolkien was really just talking about fantasy in general and not specifically fairy stories. One book I'd like to share with you guys, this is a book I believe was written in 2006. This is from Homer to Harry Potter by Dickerson and O'Hara. Overall, this is a really solid book. I haven't read the entirety of it in a number of years, but the introduction I found to be absolutely spectacular. And in it, they share the spectrum on fantasy stories. That you see on one end, we have myth. In the middle, we have heroic romance, and then on the far end, we have fairy tale. And the spectrum has to do with the spectrum of scope, that mythic stories are foundational stories, that oftentimes when we think of myth, we think about the Greek gods, right? That we have stories about the gods and titans and the foundation of the world according to the ancient Greeks. We think about the Iliad, think about the Odyssey, which, while they're not about the foundation of the world, they're the foundation of Greek culture and what the Greeks valued. Heroic romance has a narrower scope. They don't affect the entire world, but they affect at least a kingdom typically, or sometimes multiple kingdoms. Now here it's good for us to clarify what romance means in this instance. That romance originally just meant adventure. That a knight would go out on an adventure story, he would wind up fighting other knights, and guess what? Falling in love by rescuing a princess. And so over time, the term romance goes from meaning just an adventure story where the hero often falls in love to just falling in love. And so heroic romance, whenever I use that, or just the term romance in this lecture, has to do with an adventure story. High fantasy oftentimes is what this is also referred to. A fairy tale, in contrast, though, has a very narrow scope. That if you think about it, fairy tales usually only affect a handful of people. I mean, if we think about Hansel and Gretel, we have Hansel, second person's Gretel, in case you weren't following along. You have their father, their stepmother, and the witch. Total of 5 people. Even in stories where the heroine becomes a princess, such as in the case of Rapunzel, which we'll talk about tonight, or in Sleeping Beauty, no one really cares about the kingdom as a whole, right? That's almost more of a footnote. It's more about that individual character becoming a princess, working through whatever trials and tribulations she's undergone. That a fairy tale has a very narrow scope. And one thing to realize about this change in scope is that with the change in scope, we also see a change in power. That on the side of myth, we are dealing with literal gods. We are dealing with the titans and the gods that have power to overthrow the titans. If it's not directly talking about the gods, we're talking about demigods, such as Hercules, or people that are blessed by the gods, right? Like Odysseus and Agamemnon. These are absolutely, literally mythic characters that are able to shape the worlds. Heroic romance, being in the middle, they don't have the power of the gods, right? They don't have the blessings of the gods, but these are phenomenal warriors, right? These are the ones that songs and legends are told of, that are able to rescue entire kingdoms. Fairy tale hero is very different. Fairy tale hero has literally no power. That they certainly are unable to shape the foundation of the world. They're unable to save a kingdom. Usually they're unable to even save a village. Like I mentioned, Hansel and Gretel, literally the only 3 people that are saved at the end of that story are Hansel, Gretel, and their father. That these characters are extremely weak. That ties into the basic qualities of these heroes. But these heroes are typically lowly in society. That we see that in all the other types of fantasy, that the heroes are epic, they're great, sometimes literally mythic. But in fairy tales, the heroes are always lowly, that oftentimes, practically always, they're children. Whenever there are multiple kids, it is pretty much always the youngest in the family, the one who has practically no inheritance. Think about Puss in Boots. It's often the dispossessed, right? That even when we have stories that are about princesses, they get kicked out right at the start, right? I mean, Snow White is about a princess. She's a princess the entire time. She doesn't become one just at the end, but she's kicked out. So what authority she did have on Earth is cast aside at the very beginning. These fairy tale heroes are often female. They're also sometimes lacking intelligence. This is something that a lot of people don't realize, that characters like Jack and the Beanstalk, for instance, in the book of fairy tales called the Red Fairy Book, it's mentioned explicitly that Jack was a very slow boy, that he's known for being stupid. And there are a number of fairy tales that it explicitly says that this character is really dumb, but they're still the heroes of the story. And unlike heroes of myth and heroic romance, fairy tale heroes have no martial skill and often very little mental prowess. Instead, fairy tale heroes display virtue through vulnerability, directly aligning them with the values of the Beatitudes. One word that I adjusted on this just this afternoon was the word vulnerability, that I changed that from weakness. One other book that I found extremely helpful, that I don't think I directly quote in this presentation, but is absolutely phenomenal, is Back to Virtue by Peter Kreeft. That he is a Catholic theologian, but he is absolutely spot on in this book, that he goes through talking about the theological virtues and how our culture needs to go back to virtue. And then he compares and contrasts, or just contrasts, the Beatitudes with the 7 deadly sins. And so one thing that he was talking about is how meekness is not being weak. That's something we'll talk about a bit more once we actually start talking about meekness. But it's important to realize that these characters are vulnerable. That doesn't mean that they're weak, right? Because in order to actually be a hero, you have to be strong in some way, shape, or form. But this presentation is encouraging us to reconsider what the most important strengths are. So real fast, let's just go ahead and read through the Beatitudes from Matthew 5, 3 through 12. Now, there's also a version of this in Luke, but Matthew is the gospel writer that extends these, or has a few more of them. So I'd like us to focus on these. Blessed are the poor in spirit, for theirs is the kingdom of heaven. Blessed are those who mourn, for they shall be comforted. Blessed are the meek, for they shall inherit the earth. Blessed are those who hunger and thirst for righteousness, for they shall be satisfied. Blessed are the merciful, for they shall receive mercy. Blessed are the pure in heart, for they shall see God. Blessed are the peacemakers, for they shall be called sons of God. Blessed are those who are persecuted for righteousness' sake, for theirs is the kingdom of heaven. Blessed are you when others revile you and persecute you, and utter all kinds of evil against you falsely on my account. Rejoice and be glad, for your reward is great in heaven. For so they persecuted the prophets who were before you. Now, let's go ahead and talk about some of the core features of the Beatitudes. The one thing Kreeft mentions in this book is that blessedness is not happiness. That some translations translate blessedness as happiness, and this is, first of all, just a bad translation. Secondly, it's nonsensical. Blessed are those who mourn, for they shall be comforted. It doesn't work if it's happy. Happy are those who mourn, right? That you have just lost the most precious person in your life, but you're happy, right? That happy are the poor in spirit, for yours is the kingdom of heaven. No, you're not happy. You are poor in spirit. And that's why it's vital that this is translated as blessed. That by being blessed, it's not talking about immediate gratification, right? That's what happiness is. Blessed is a type of resting in the fact that we are chosen by God and that we are secure in Him. And that's why we can be extremely unhappy and still have hope. That we are blessed when we mourn, for we are comforted. It's also important for us to realize that with the Beatitudes, that there is the inevitability of suffering and persecution. That this is not a if. I'm not even convinced that it's a when. That it's really continual, if you think about it. That if we talk about being poor in spirit, all have fallen short of the glory of God, right? That's not a if we fall short, right? It's not okay, just whenever you fall short, it's okay. This is a state of our being at this point. And as we understand that being a state of our being, it's also a state of mourning, right? I think really good statement is that how we're really pilgrims in this life. And that means a state of constant mourning because we are constantly dispossessed, like the fairy tale heroes. We also see a focus on weakness and peacemaking. Should have changed that, like I mentioned earlier, to vulnerability and peacemaking, not physical strength and personal glory. We also see that acknowledging our weakness leads us to Christ, that the only reason why we are blessed is because the second half of all of these ties into Christ. When it says, blessed are those who mourn, for they shall be comforted, it's not some abstract comfort. It's not your neighbor is going to come tomorrow and comfort you. It is that Christ will comfort you in some sense in that moment, but ultimately when He returns. And that trusting in our own strength prevents us from knowing Him. It's vital that we understand this, that we constantly want to say, whenever we mourn, that I'm really okay, right? And that I think this is something that modern psychology has partially right. That there's this understanding that you have to admit you have a problem before you can resolve it, right? But that's not the final step, right? Because you can't solve the problem. That I can't comfort myself when I'm mourning. If I'm poor in spirit because the world has beaten me down, because I'm trying to follow Christ, there's only so much I can do, and my wife knows there's only so much she can do. That if I'm looking to earth to give me any real hope, then that hope is futile. Unless we look to Christ and our reunion with Him after these trials. But that's truly the only way that we're able to find eventually happiness, right? That we are blessed now. We are not called to happiness in this life, but we will have happiness because we are blessed. Let's take a quick look at some of the Beatitudes through Christ's ministry just to get a slightly better understanding of them before we actually apply these two fairy tales. That first of all, blessed are those who mourn. This is one who is really, that has really stuck with me over the years. Partially because I hear a lot of Christians saying, oh, we're not really mourning because they're Christ now. And Paul specifically says, do not grieve as those who have no hope. He doesn't say don't grieve. He says don't grieve as those who have no hope. And moreover, not only does Paul say that, but Christ cries at Lazarus' tomb. He cries when he's going to raise the man from the dead in the next 5 minutes. And if Christ is going to weep that close to a resurrection that he himself is about to perform, how dare we not mourn? Whether it be the literal death of someone close to us, or sometimes it's just a sorrow, right? Blessed are those who hunger and thirst for righteousness. That we have Christ talking about how man shall not live on bread alone, but every word coming from the mouth of God, refusing to break his fast within the desert. We see him feeding the 5,000, right? We see the Samaritan woman at the well. That those times, all three of those times, say, yes, physical food and drink is important, but it's supposed to point us to something better. And our hunger and our thirst will be rewarded because we are blessed. And next we have, blessed are the peacemakers, for they shall be called sons of God. Here we see Christ rebuking Peter for cutting off a servant's ear, right? And I think this is potentially one of the trickiest Beatitudes to fully comprehend. They're all really difficult, but I think this is one of the trickiest, right? Because we have Christ himself saying that he has come not to bring peace, but to bring the sword, right? That he says that he's setting father against brother, sister against sister, right? And there's this difficulty when trying to parse this out. But I think that the answer to it is that we have to be willing to suffer when we are called to suffer, right? That we're not trying to stir up chaos. That there are times when we are going to wind up bringing a lot of division if we are called to call out sin. But we're calling it out in order to form peace, right? That's the ultimate goal. That I know within myself and within all of you, there are too many times that we like to call people out because we get to get on to them about something. Yeah. And that's not in the spirit of being a peacemaker, right? That is in the end causing division for your own sake. Finally, briefly, let's cover, blessed are those who are persecuted for righteousness' sake, for theirs is the kingdom of heaven. And we see that ultimately with Christ, that if anyone was persecuted for righteousness' sake, Christ is the ultimate one. But of course, it doesn't end with his death, but ends with his resurrection. For ours is the kingdom of heaven. It's not just his, but it's ours. That's something for us to realize, is that we will partake in Christ's victory, because ultimately we are his. Now, let's go ahead and try to synthesize everything. That we've talked a lot about fantasy, then we've talked about how specifically fairy tales are slightly different than your heroic romance stories or your mythic stories. But let's try to synthesize that with the understanding of the Beatitudes. Let me briefly go through the story of Rapunzel. This is as it's found in the Brothers Grimm. There are a couple of different versions of it. But it starts off with a couple that has longed for a child. This is one thing that's left out of a lot of the modern tellings, is that this couple has been barren for a long time, and eventually they find out that they're pregnant. And the wife is going through her pregnancy. She's having pregnancy cravings, and she says, you know what, I'm going to absolutely die if I don't get some of the rampion from the witch's house next door. Rampion, I'll show you a picture of it in just a minute. It's a type of leafy plant that has a radish at the bottom, radish-like vegetable. And basically she really wants a salad from this rampion, is what's going on here. And so the husband sneaks over one night, he's able to get it, he comes back, all's good. A few days later, the wife says, oh, I'm gonna die if I don't get more rampion. And so the husband sneaks back over again, and guess what? The witch catches him. And so as he's groveling, he explains that he's only doing this for his wife. His wife's pregnant, is having these cravings, and she'll die if she doesn't get this rampion. And the witch says, okay, I'll actually let you take back as much as you want. But I can tag your child.
Wow.
And so the wife gets as much rampion as she wants, but the witch takes the child after the child's born and names her Rampion, which also means Rapunzel. It's another name for it. Which then locks Rapunzel into a tower, and she lives there for a number of years in isolation, only seeing the witch periodically. And one day she's singing, and as she's singing, there's a prince who is just wandering the woods, and he hears her voice, and he sits outside of her window and listens. He sees at some point the witch come, and she shouts, "Rapunzel, Rapunzel, let down your hair." Rapunzel lets down her hair, the witch goes up, eventually she goes back down and leaves, and then the prince uses the same technique in order to ascend the tower. "Rapunzel, Rapunzel, let down your hair." Rapunzel then lets down her hair, the prince climbs up, and they wind up seeing each other a number of times, and they agree to run off together. That the prince agrees to give her some small blankets every time he comes up, and eventually she's going to form a rope and be able to climb down. But one day, Rapunzel accidentally lets loose that the prince has been there. And so the witch, in anger, cuts off Rapunzel's hair and banishes Rapunzel into the desert. The prince then comes in the next day or so and shouts, "Rapunzel, Rapunzel, let down your hair." And the witch tosses the hair down. The prince climbs up and finds the witch there. And she says, "You will never see your love again, but she has been sent away, far away where you can never find her." This is where it changes a lot from the Disney story. He then jumps out of the tower in despair, trying to end himself.
Oh.
Yeah, it's very different. I wonder why they left that out. But he jumps out. Come to find out, his fall was broken by a bush, but it was a bramble bush poking his eyes out.
No.
And so he is wandering around for years, just lost. He has absolutely no purpose. But in the years of wandering, he eventually hears a voice, and it's Rapunzel's again. And he approaches her. She starts weeping. And it's literally her tears. It is blessed are those who mourn, for they shall be comforted. And comfort is just a type of healing, right? Her tears fall. They fall upon his eyes, and his vision is restored. So after this, the prince returns to his kingdom with Rapunzel and also their two twins. Apparently something else they left out of the Disney story. A little bit more going on in that tower than they let on in Tangled. But now that we've taken a look at least the basic story of Rapunzel according to the Brothers Grimm, let's see exactly how this ties into the Beatitudes. We'll just walk through these one by one. So first of all, blessed are the poor in spirit, for theirs is the kingdom of heaven. So we see first of all that literally Rapunzel comes from poor parents, right? We also see that this is a female protagonist, right? Someone without a whole lot of agency. One thing we don't realize about Rapunzel, though, is that her name is a mockery. That with fairy tales, you sometimes have heroines' names that are meant to show their beauty, right? We think about Snow White, Sleeping Beauty. That's some of the time. Some of the times they're in mockery, right? You think about Cinderella, we think, oh, beautiful name, beautiful yellow ball gown. But she was forced to sleep in the cinders, and her name was Ella. Her name was literally Cinderella in mockery. Rapunzel, as we talked about, means rampion, means head of lettuce. So what the witch does by naming this child Rapunzel is every time her name is called, she is reminded, hey, your parents sold you for a salad.
Wow.
That is literally what is being conveyed every time her name is called. That I mean, that has to be the epitome of being poor in spirit, right? You think nicknames are bad. I mean, that's even worse than a boy named Sue. Next, blessed are those who mourn, for they shall be comforted. First of all, we see that the prince mourns the loss of Rapunzel. One thing I'll talk a bit more about on the next slide is how Rapunzel symbolizes the good. That's something we don't really understand in a lot of these fairy tales, not in all of them, but in a lot of these fairy tales, the heroines don't actually grow that much. If you think about Rapunzel, she's already an ethical person. She seems to love pretty well. And Cinderella doesn't learn that much. She, once again, is able to love pretty well. The person who's really saved, maybe not physically, but spiritually, is the prince. But this prince is just wandering around in the middle of nowhere. He has duties back at home, but he's just wasting his life without purpose. He's aimless. And when he finds that purpose, he is bereaved of it for a short time. Has to wander 6 years in the wilderness, right? Think about the Israelites wandering 40 years in the desert, right? This idea of you failed, but God's not going to give up on you. In fact, I'm just going to make you mourn for a little while, and then you'll enter the promised land. Then, like I pointed out, it's literally through the act of mourning that the prince is comforted, that he's healed. It's also interesting that it's the part of Rapunzel's body that actually heals that precise part of the prince's body, right? If you think about Christ being wounded for our iniquities, every individual lash he took wound up taking a far harsher lash from our own backs. That what's the phrase? I'm blanking on what theologian that said it, but the unassumed is the unredeemed. That the idea that Christ had to assume every part of humanity so that he could suffer every ounce of what we suffer in order for it to be restored. Let's go ahead and talk about blessed are the meek, for they shall inherit the earth. Once again, it's this idea of being humble versus being proud. That Rapunzel's parents wind up losing her due to their pride. And it's interesting. I find a lot of correlation between this and the Garden of Eden. That everyone likes to point out that it's really Eve's fault that humanity fell, because she was the one who ate first. But does anyone know why Adam ate after that? The exact verse. It says that, and she gave to her husband who was with her. That he's the one who's standing idly by and saying, okay, I'll let you take the reins even though this is a bad idea. That's precisely what's going on here. That even though it's not the wife who's going out getting the rampion, he's the one who says, okay, I'll let you take the reins. I'll do exactly what you say, even though I know this is a bad idea. It's his pride saying, you know what? We've longed for a child, but getting a couple of nights of peace, not hearing about how I can't pick up salad from McDonald's, but I have to go to the witch's house next door. A couple of nights of peace is worth stealing from a witch. We also have Rapunzel, who, as we talked about, being poor in spirit, is the meekest, right? And at the very end, she becomes a princess. Once again, as we talked about with the prince, it's through this idea of being broken. The prince at the start is not broken at all, right? I mean, he seems to be living a very carefree life, just wandering the woods. I mean, he's a prince. How can he really be meek? Well, he's taught. That, first of all, he realizes that there is something to aspire to, right? I think that's why the image of the tower is very important, that she's not locked in some random cottage, right? But she literally is above him. That's this idea of climbing Jacob's ladder, right? Christ ascending into heaven. This idea of the soul going up, right? That is through his climb, that he is able to participate in that which is good. That Rapunzel represents that. But it's interesting. He goes up, but he inherits the earth, right? And I think with this metaphor of this ascending, whether it be Jacob's ladder, whether it be Christ ascending in heaven, whether it be the prince ascending to reach Rapunzel, it also ties into inheriting the earth, right? Because right before Christ ascends, he says, I'm going to come back. It's not we are going to stay in the clouds forever, right? But that Christ will come back and inherit the earth. Just as we see the prince and Rapunzel inheriting a kingdom at the very end of this. Blessed are those who hunger and thirst for righteousness, for they shall be satisfied. We've talked a lot about how the prince is longing throughout this entire narrative, that he's longing for Rapunzel. And I think that what's so comforting about a lot of these fairy tales is that the princes are sometimes really dumb. We have some instances like Disney's Sleeping Beauty, which I believe is absolutely phenomenal, where the prince is very competent, he's very heroic, but there are some stories where these princes are as dumb as rocks. That we see that the prince hungers and thirsts for goodness, right? He hungers and thirsts for what Rapunzel represents. But he ultimately is led astray temporarily by just kind of the accoutrement, right? The attachments, right? That the whole point of the long hair is to lead you to the face, right? And he is so entrapped with the idea of climbing her hair that he loses sight of the right face is not connected to the opposite end of the hair, and he sees the witch. Isn't that the same thing that we do with God constantly? That I'm of the type of temperament to be hyper intellectual. That I like to view God as this logic puzzle sometimes, and I get so fixated on that to just one aspect of God, and I miss the face of Christ. And that's what we do whenever we hyper focus on one aspect of Christ. That we're not focusing on Him. Those point us to Him, but unless we actually understand Him entirely, which is always going to be part of our duty as Christians, then we have really lost sight of what we're supposed to search for. But despite his foolishness, he continues to hunger and thirst, right? And that, like with the prince, God does not ask us to hunger and thirst flawlessly. He just asks us to hunger and thirst. And then we will be satisfied. Next, let's talk about blessed are the merciful, for they shall receive mercy. We have the idea of taking from people rather than giving mercy. That we have the prince the witch, who winds up taking Rapunzel. That we have the parents who take the life of their child, not literally killing her, but take the opportunity for her to have a good childhood, once again, so that the mom can have a Sabbath. It's this idea that they're going to take so that they can feed themselves, sometimes literally. However, we have Rapunzel being the person who gives throughout the story, right? She's the one who gives her hand to the prince in marriage. She's the one who gives her life to these children. She had to go through pregnancy and give birth to twins in the middle of the wilderness and raise them by herself for a number of years. That she winds up being the one who gives, right? Looks on people who need assistance, right? And what is parenthood but looking at your child and realizing you really need assistance. And in the end, she receives mercy. Also have blessed are the pure in heart, for they shall see God. have impure characters, the witch obviously being self-absorbed. We have Rapunzel's parents that they show themselves right off the bat to be impure characters, right? It starts off with, we really want a child. How much though, if you were willing to dip out within a couple of months because it got tough? The prince, however, it's clear to see how Rapunzel is a pure character. The prince is a bit more difficult because the prince does fail, like we talked about. But remember what I mentioned about the issue of hyper-focusing on an aspect of God rather than the entirety of God. The prince's issue is not that he didn't purely seek after Rapunzel, but that his mindset was too narrow, right? And once again, I think through the story we see that God is gracious and even a definition of pure in heart, right? Because he realizes we are going to screw up. But at the end, we will see God, that we might climb up the tower at the wrong time and find the wrong thing at the top. But that doesn't mean that after years of wondering that God won't reveal himself, that we won't see him. Now, I believe this right here is our final slide before closing thoughts. Blessed are the peacemakers, for they shall be called sons of God. Remember what I mentioned about magic in fantasy stories at the very beginning. The idea that the good characters are ones who use magic in order to be more in tune with nature, with their fellow humans, and wicked witches, wicked magicians wind up using magic in order to sow discord. But that's exactly what the witch does here, right? Is that she sows discord. She's able to have this wonderful rampion. She's able to have this tower in the middle of the woods. But all that magic is used for ill, right? The only other example that we see of magic in this story is Rapunzel's tears. Tears that give peace to her prince and allows her family to go home. But finally, blessed are those who are persecuted for righteousness' sake, for theirs is the kingdom of heaven. We have characters who suffer, who refuse to suffer, are eternally punished. We talked a fair amount of Rapunzel's parents. They've longed their whole marriage to have a child, and they blew their chance in probably literally the worst way possible. The witch, we don't see her being directly punished in this, but she has the same fate as Rapunzel's parents, isolation. She's by herself. That if you've ever read C.S. Lewis's The Great Divorce, he talks about the people that are in the deepest circles of hell are actually the furthest away from the closest person. That hell is being isolation from not only your fellow man, but most importantly from God, because you think my way is how things should be done. And quote C.S. Lewis again, everyone gets what they want, but they don't always like it. But those who seek good in fairy tales are punished, right? I mean, they are persecuted. That's what persecution is. It is doing the right thing, having the right goal, and getting punished for it. But eventually they are rewarded. That Rapunzel, like I said, she doesn't really seem to grow that much. The only real issue she makes in the entire story is a slip of the tongue, mentioning that the prince had been there. And she's punished despite all of her goodness. We have the prince who grows a lot, but is severely punished for it. But despite that, eventually they're both rewarded. So here are some final thoughts. One other book I'd like to recommend to everyone is a book by G.K. Chesterton called Orthodoxy. This is an absolutely phenomenal book. But something I might bring up during the Q&A is his chapter on paradoxes of Christianity, because that actually ties into the spectrum of fantasy quite well. But he has this beautiful chapter 4 in Orthodoxy called The Ethics of Elfland. And he starts it off with just this beautiful paragraph about how when he was a kid, he loved fairy stories, and all the adults were like, when you get old, you'll realize those are stupid. But he says towards the end of the paragraph, men said that I should lose my ideals found in fairy tales and begin to believe in the methods of practical politicians. Now I have not lost my ideals in the least. My faith in fundamentals is exactly what it always was. What I have lost is my old childlike faith in practical politics. That as we grow up, we tend to get a bit more cynical, right? We think, what good is Rapunzel going to do me when there's an election coming up next year? Guess what happens 4 years after the next election? The next election. And during that time, we'll have almost literally, if not literally, every politician go against the oaths they've sworn in office. Right? But these fairy tales, viewed properly, point us towards the gospel. Another wonderful quote Chesterton has in this chapter is he says that in fairy tales you have rivers run with wine, so that for one wild moment you can remember that in the real world they run with water, that they should enchant us with the world that God has made. If we don't come out of a fairy tale with a better understanding of how God has made the world and a better appreciation for him, it's either a very poorly written fairy tale or we're really not seeing things properly. That we're not seeing things humbly, meekly, as in the Beatitudes. That leads us to one of the most intimidating quotes I find in the Gospels. When Christ says, unless you turn and become like children, you will never enter the kingdom of heaven. I think this is why fairy tales are so akin to the gospel. It's because they're about children. They're viewed as being for children. But like Chesterton says, that as we grow older, we can either become more cynical or we can become more childlike. While all good stories reflect aspects of God's nature, which during our Q&A we can talk a bit more about the rest of the spectrum of fantasy and how that ties into the gospel. Fairy tales specifically reflect the Beatitudes and demonstrate the essential virtues of Christianity. Not everyone can be strong, but everyone is called to be courageous. Not everyone can be brilliant, but everyone is called to be loving. In our Savior's greatest trial, he did not call down angels to remove him from the cross, although it was well within his power to do so. He chose to die willingly. Christ accomplished the feat of salvation not through a demonstration of power, but through meekness before his Father and before others. May fairy tales help us to develop such meekness, and may they spur us to better hunger and thirst for righteousness.
Let's move into Q&A. Yes.
All right.
I saw some people taking notes. Any immediate questions? Like, for example, you never once said meta-narrative. Can you talk about that?
I've heard a couple of definitions of that. Can you define it for me precisely?
Oh, man. It's like the arc of all stories being related to essentially the gospel.
Yeah.
There's always a Christ figure. There's always redemption.
So, I think the best place to start with that question is when Christ says, I am the vine, you are the branches. Okay? That we usually think of that as a metaphor. Well, Christ is like the vine, right? Because that's how he phrases it. We are like the branches, when in fact it's the other way around. That at the beginning of John's gospel, in the beginning, totally blank on the exact quote, but everything was made through Christ, and without him nothing was made that was made. And so by definition, everything has to point back to Christ. That it's not merely that vines are sort of like Jesus, or it's that by their nature, they have to point back to him. That if you think about this, even something as simple as a chair, right? That a chair has stability. We find that it's properly made. It has stability, it has beauty. And the purpose of those definitions is those are traits that God is the author of, right? That God is the author of consistency, of stability, right? Beauty. And everything that he created and everything that we make as sub-creators, by definition, have to point back to him. And so that I think that that's definitely a valid point with every good story. But one thing that has struck me so much about fairy tales is, once again, the spectrum, right? Is that I think that heroic romance also ties into the idea of a Christ figure, right? I mean, that's what the knight does when we take Sir Thomas Malory's L'Amour d'Arthur, where a knight comes and rescues 100 maidens from a tower, right? Is that he is a Christ figure bringing salvation. That we see stories of King Arthur with them being fantastic knights. But one thing I'm currently working on, this presentation has helped me think about this a bit more, is how the greatest of all the knights in Arthurian romances ultimately have to do with a Grail quest, right? You hear a lot about this, from Monty Python, the Holy Grail, to pretty much everyone talks about the Grail quest, right? You think about it's the greatest knights, but it's not the knight that shows their martial prowess. They don't have a big tournament and the winner gets the Grail to take home and put on their shelf. It's not through the virtues of heroic romance that the Grail is attained. And in fact, in Sir Thomas Malory's L'Amour d'Arthur, Lancelot explicitly fails because he is only great at the heroic romance traits. He's not humble. He doesn't have the virtues of a fairy tale hero. And it's interesting with the idea of the Grail quest, how it kind of morphs into a fairy tale at the same time. That Galahad winds up in L'Amour d'Arthur leaving the realm because he's called up like Enoch or something. Because he has become a fairy tale hero. And that's why he becomes the hero of the Grail quest, according to Malory. And so I think there is something where we see the idea of heroic romance, that those are very important, but they can cause us to lose sight of the virtues of the Beatitudes, that there's something in physical strength that causes us to forget about what we're actually called to do, right? It's the idea of anyone who becomes famous, even within Christian circles, sometimes especially within Christian circles, that they fall into sin, right? Whether it be sexual sin or otherwise, right? That they have become these great heroes that are looked up to by entire countries almost. But then they forget the basic virtues of the Beatitudes: to be meek, to actually mourn properly, to hunger and thirst. I would like to talk a little bit about myth, though. Like I talked about with John 1:1, Scripture is about, obviously, the foundation of the world, how we should look through. Scripture is the lens to see everything. And like I mentioned with Chesterton's orthodoxy, he has this absolutely fantastic chapter on the paradoxes of Christianity. And in it, he starts off by taking a look at Aristotle's golden mean. Aristotle teaches that courage is 50-50, that on one end of a spectrum, you have love of self, on the other end, you have love of country. Okay, so if you only love yourself, then you're going to be a coward. You're going to run away. If you only love your country, then you're going to wind up just dying instantly because you charge into battle too quickly. And he says, okay, the answer to this is 50-50. You need to love yourself 50% and then love your country 50%. But God's not 50-50. He is 100-100. And that is what Chesterton talks about in this. That It's this idea that the actual virtue of courage is 100%. You need to love your country, you need to love your family, but then you also need to love yourself 100% because Christ died for you. And the weird thing is that they feed into each other, right? So the more you love yourself, you realize, well, part of the reason why my life is so good is because I have a wonderful wife. If my wife's in danger because my country's in danger, that means I need to defend my country. And then if you love your country so much, then you're like, well, I'm really thankful that I live here. And it's this idea that when you love both to the extreme, they actually meet each other. Just like the incarnation, where we have myth, the foundation of the world, the Logos, being born in a manger in the humblest location possible. And I think what fairy tales do is that they help us understand when East meets West, when mercy meets justice, when God becomes man. But it's a fairy tale, or it's a myth wrapped up in a fairy tale, I would say. So, good question. Any other questions?
So which of the two fairy tales from the J.R. Tolkien or the C.S. Lewis do you think are message in your head? What you see as a fairy tale? Who does it better?
So it's important for us to understand a couple of things about Tolkien is that, of course, he's most well known for his Lord of the Rings. And the Lord of the Rings is kind of a weird mesh of all three of these categories. Keep in mind this is a spectrum. With most stories, you can place it roughly in a section. So, for instance, we would say that Sir Thomas Malory's Mordred is pretty much dead center. We have the story of Oedipus Rex, which would be kind of the middle here. And then you would have stories about like the foundation of the Greek world, and that would be full-blown myth, right? Tolkien's Lord of the Rings is literally everywhere. You have Sauron, which this is how you interpret the entire world, right? Because Sauron is endangering all the free peoples. But then you have Aragorn, who is very much a king that comes in and he brings order to multiple countries. And then you have the hobbits, who are just fairy tale heroes that are thrown into a heroic romance / myth. And so I think that this is a helpful spectrum. And like I said, typically you can place stories in individual points, roughly, but Tolkien kind of breaks that rule a bit. Now, I think that Tolkien's fairy tales, if you've ever read Farmer Giles of Ham, if you've read Smith of Wootton Major or Roverandrum, I think that Smith of Wootton Major is definitely a fairy tale. Roverandrum is definitely a fairy tale. Farmer Giles of Ham kind of falls in this section, if you've ever read that. Lewis, I'm not sure if Lewis wrote any fairy tales, but his Narnia books typically take place somewhere within the heroic romance to mythic section, right? Sometimes having very fairy tale-like characters, kind of like what we were talking about with Tolkien. You have Pevensey children who start off as fairy tale heroes, right? They're just random kids that are dispossessed during wartime, but then they become kings and queens, right? Most of Lewis's stories, though, have to do with either relatively straight up myth or relatively straight up heroic romance. So for instance, you have The Last Battle, which is about the end of the world, right? You have The Magician's Nephew, that's about the foundation of the world. But then you have stories like The Horse and His Boy or The Silver Chair, where it's really just about rescuing certain people and trying to help out one or two individual nations. If you think about in the Silver Chair, you have the Green Lady and she has the Black Knight. I believe it's the Black Knight that rides by her. That's a direct reference to heroic romances. So, any further questions about that? Or?
No, I kind of always taken some of the fairy tales because of the kids and being brought in, and then the Turkish delight.
Yeah,
the evil that's there, kind of they have to face.
Yeah, and like I said, it kind of starts off as a fairy tale in some ways, and then it sort of moves into heroic romance, right? Because you have Peter towards the end of even this the Lion, the Witch, and the Wardrobe. He's leading an entire army of centaurs and unicorns into battle, right? So he starts off as one of these dispossessed kids, and then he becomes a hero of heroic romance towards the middle of them. So,
You never said which you like better.
what, Lord of the Rings or Narnia? Definitely Lord of the Rings.
You're allowed to be wrong.
No.
All right, any other questions?
Have you given some thought to why the Beatitude reward is what it is? In other words, why is it the meek that inherit the earth and not become called, sons of God? Or could there be an interchange? And as you're kind of examining the fairy tales, I mean, do you see that particular pattern, or could there be like an interchange as you're examining them?
Yeah, so I think that I can probably only give you a partial answer to that. That some of them are obviously pretty straightforward, right? Hunger and thirst for righteousness, be satisfied, be merciful, they receive mercy. More and comforted.
Right.
I think the other ones are kind of things that I'm working through. That, let's take a look at verse 5, blessed are the meek, for they shall inherit the earth. That I've been talking to my wife about how we're really dealing with a frustrating kid at school right now, and I've been talking to administrators trying to figure out what's going on, kind of the best way to deal with it. And so I've been praying, okay, how's the best way to be meek during this? And being meek and humble, a lot of times, or a ton of times, means just not giving up on someone at the drop of a hat, right? And another metaphor that we oftentimes use for that is sowing seeds. And when you sow seeds, you inherit the earth. And so I'm kind of wondering if that's part of what's going on here, right? Christ has at least a couple parables about sowing seeds, right? And I'm wondering if there is a lot more nuance than one might think at the start, that really just takes a lot more time to ponder, if that makes sense.
I didn't understand the question. What was the question?
Oh, the question was just why are basically the second half of some of these verses attached to the first half? Is that roughly what you're asking?
Yeah, some are obvious, like
Mhm.
mourn and comforted, but
Yeah.
with meek, why is it not kingdom of heaven? Why is it inherit the earth?
Mhm.
I mean,
Yeah. Yeah, and like I said, that's something that I'm still kind of working through myself. So, any other questions?
Could some of it be cultural expectation versus spiritual reality? Referencing back to this question, given that even just thinking about how the Jews expected the Messiah to come and be a military leader, they didn't expect him to be meek at all. They expected him to be a leader, a fighter.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, and it's also one thing I'd like to look at the Greek for poor in spirit and meek, because those are two rather vague terms. Because meek, one definition of it is weakness, right? Which is, like I talked about, is not something that Christ is discussing here. That in order to be virtuous, you have to be strong, right? That's a different type of strength. And poor in spirit, once again, is a little bit of a vague term. So that might be something to look into the Greek and see if it sheds any light on that.
This might be a little bit off.
Yeah.
but When you're poor in spirit, you have room to grow.
Mhm.
And Christ also talks about the kingdom of heaven being like the pearl that you have to seek and you have to go and find.
Mhm.
So as you're poor in spirit, you're seeking for those things, so the kingdom of heaven becomes yours, because you don't have the pride.
Mhm.
You know?
It's true.
Joseph, I see a progression
Mhm.
from poor in spirit if you are poor in spirit and realize your need for Christ, for the Lord, then all of these other things fall in place to the point where you get to the last that you're hunger and you thirst for righteousness.
Yeah, there is a very natural progression, and I think that this also leads us something similar to what we see even within our church worship service, right? That it's kind of walking through kind of the state of the Christian. That you start off, that when you're convicted of your sin, that you are poor in spirit. You realize, woe is me, for I am undone. And that causes you to mourn. The mourning then causes you to be humble or meek, which then leads you to start hungering and thirsting for righteousness. And then you realize, oh, Christ has come for us, right? That means we should also be merciful. Well, in order to be merciful, we have to be pure in heart. And if we're pure in heart, that also means we should strive for peace, right? But guess what? Peacemakers are ironically persecuted. So there is a very natural progression to them.
We can't be a peacemaker without all the other above.
Yeah. So, and I'd argue that it's only under persecution that you see how much of a peacemaker you are, right? That whenever students talk to me about pacifism, I tell them that I have a lot of respect for pacifists when they're pacifists after being picked on. That it's easy to be a pacifist. Not that I'm saying that Christ says that pacifism is the way, right? We see him chasing out the money changers. So there's definitely a lot to talk about that. But everyone likes the idea of pacifism until someone starts picking on them, right? And so I think persecution, even just down to, like I was talking about dealing with a kid at school, when I have to deal with someone getting really frustrated with me and interrupting the class, am I wanted to actually make peace, or I wanted to throw my weight around, right, to feel better about myself. It's only under that pressure that you can actually tell if someone's a peacemaker. So, okay, last call for questions.
I wanted to mention that you made a parallel to C.S. Lewis's Four Loves.
Mm-hmm.
In the take love, give love, need love, give love.
Mm-hmm.
And I like that. I thought that was really good. Blessed are the merciful, for they shall receive mercy. And Lewis talks about that. Anyway, this is fantastic. Do you teach this at school?
I teach as much as I can get away with in a public school.
The reason why I say that, or I ask or mention that is I was very linear in mind, like science and math and stuff like that.
Yeah.
As a kid, but as I've aged, I've gotten better at the reading and the comprehension and that sort of thing. This would have been fabulous for me as a kid in high school, because I think I would have gotten this, but because I didn't get it as a kid, because I went to a secular school, I just never got anything. So English and literature were always difficult for me. It's kind of like one of those things where science and math were easy, and history, straight A's, no problem there. I could do anything. But this kind of stuff, I was the worst.
Yeah, and I think the best analogy is actually in the first Harry Potter book, because Harry comes home early in the first Harry Potter book with all of his books for Hogwarts, and you're thinking he's probably going to open up like the really cool books about all the awesome flying spells and whatnot. The book he really loves reading on his own is The History of Magic, his history textbook. But then it's one of his least favorite classes in all of his school years, because it's taught by a literal ghost. This dude literally died in the room next to his classroom, and he didn't realize he died, and so he just walks back to teach his class and then falls back asleep in his chair. It's this great metaphor for how a student's love for a subject can be literally killed by a teacher who doesn't have passion for it.
Why were we forced to to read Lord of the Flies instead of Lord of the Rings. I mean, some of the books I see, my kids have to read, and I'm like, I didn't want to read those. It's kind of like, there's so many fun books to read. Why don't?
Yeah.
I think they pick the fun books in
The
high school.
redemption all through Lord of the Flies too. I mean, they're the allegory that you can pull through that just as much of who's redeemed at the end and who's not in that story as well. Because I taught high school English too, and you can pull that for any story, like for the meta narrative that all these stories, well-written stories, are going to have a redemption element. They're going to have an element of, good versus evil, light versus dark. So even though some of these stories look like on the surface might not have those elements, they're there too.
Sure.
I don't know much about the Brothers Grimm, but do you know if they were Christian and they were trying to teach Christian virtues?
No, so with the Brothers Grimm, it's interesting because they were actually primarily linguists. That people don't realize that they were language nerds. And one thing that they did is they came up with Grimm's Law, which if I remember correctly from undergrad, it's about the change of like the sound of the H or something like that. It's something really, really nerdy and minute. But one thing that they did is they went around and collected these fairy tales. And so you have the question, to what extent do they just write these down as they were told, and to what extent are they curated? And that's something we don't necessarily know. But some stories we know are extremely curated, such as Charles Perrault, the Mother Goose Tales, that he's the one who told a version of Cinderella, which the Disney version is based off of. I actually like the Grimm's version better by and large. But Perrault also told Little Red Riding Hood. And so we know that those are explicitly curated versus other works like the Brothers Grimm. We don't know what extent they're just collected. Yeah. Oh, Hans Christian Andersen is someone who did write original fairy tales. And then George MacDonald, he was someone who inspired Lewis and Chesterton and Tolkien. He also wrote his own fairy tales, which are really good. So.
It is a fascinating study into how much the human soul longs for the truth. Just seeing how much, even in secular stories today, you can see it. Where we clearly, we know something's wrong with us, and we know that we can't fix it.
Well, it's also interesting, and one thing I'm working through personally is trying to figure out to what extent our authorial intent matters. And what I mean by that is a couple of things. First of all, to what extent do good artists just speak from what they've been indoctrinated with? And I mean that in a good way. That Tolkien gave his priest the Fellowship of the Ring, and his priest finished it and said, yeah, it was really good. And actually the Lady Galadriel is really similar to the Virgin Mary. And Tolkien's like, oh, I had no clue, but that totally makes sense. Or if you think about the Lord of Gondor, right? The steward seems very similar to the Pope if you think about it. That the idea that he's supposed to be in charge just until the king comes back, but guess what? The steward kind of likes his power a little too much. So it's an interesting thought, right? Not that I think the critique of Catholicism was in there intentionally by Tolkien, but you do get this idea that he's been indoctrinated because he was just immersed is a better word than indoctrinated, immersed within these things, right? And I think to create good Christian art, a lot of it needs to be just immersed. One final point I'll make on this, and then we'll go ahead and break for snack, or stop for snacks, not break, sorry, stop for snacks, is that if anyone's ever read Oscar Wilde's picture Dorian Gray, that really good book, really dark book, and in his introduction, he says that ethics don't matter. The only thing that matters is whether or not it's a good piece of art.
Wow.
But if you read the picture Dorian Gray, you can read it and say, this is just a really good ethical story about how you can turn really dark if you only pursue aesthetics. That if you take that introduction away, and part of me wonders if he's such a good artist that he was actually better than his philosophy. Which by God's grace, sometimes we are a lot better than our philosophy. That, I mean, if people actually lived out postmodernism, the world would be even worse than it currently is. So, all right.
I was going to say, did you take the naming of the Christians in the book of Acts as a name of mockery?
I've not thought about that, to be honest.
What do you mean by that?
It's,
Give an example.
I've been told that the pagans were calling the Christians Christians.
Oh, sorry, the term Christian.
Yeah.
Gotcha. So it's interesting because
Sometimes
Yeah.
one can say, I think it's a Gentile.
that was interesting.
Okay. Well, thank you everyone for being here, and appreciate you so much for your presentation.